my noise making when experimenting with all these different sounds and projects. So, my talk today is going to be about interdisciplinary work in music, sound, and visual art. So I'm going to give you an overview of the type of art that I come from, the type of discipline that I come from, sound and music, and then talk about a few projects that I've done where I've collaborated with visual artists. I think it's important to start by explaining what sound art is, because that's the area of discipline that I'm coming from. So sound art is essentially an artistic discipline where sound is used as the primary medium. So you can take that to mean pretty much anything involving sound. The obvious one would be music, but the distinction here that a lot of people in the realm of sound art like to make are non-traditional means. So experiencing and listening to sound and music in a non-traditional way, or interacting with sound and music in a different way. And I've included a picture of how sound actually enters our bodies and how we process it. So sound is essentially vibrations in the air that travels through the ear canal, and it makes the eardrum vibrate, and the hip bone is connected to the leg bone, and so on and so forth. So you guys know, we're going to come back to the actual mechanics later. You'll see this picture again. But a lot of sound art focuses at the end of this whole process. So after the auditory nerve picks up those vibrations, how do we process sound? So culturally and societally, we have certain indicators for organized sound for music. We know instantly when a piece of music is sad, it's slow, it sounds gloomy, and we can't quite put it into words. Or loud sounds. Our reaction to that would be annoyance or fear that something is going wrong. A very loud and sudden noise. So I'm going to give a brief overview on sound art. A lot of people involved in sound art like to associate the beginning of sound art when sound was more intentionally used to convey emotions and to convey abstract concepts, as they like to associate it with when the mechanical phonograph cylinder was invented. It was the first practical audio recording device, and it was invented by Thomas Edison. We now know that Thomas Edison's team more so invented it, but he's still given credit for the invention. Though I like to think that the beginnings of sound art and creative thought in sound, it can really be dated back to the oldest instruments. When the first musical instruments were created intentionally. So I have a picture of a bone flute. This was found in Germany, I believe just a few years ago in the 2000s, but it's believed to be the oldest musical instrument. Is made out of a vulture's bone, and that's important because you can see how creativity factors into the creation of this instrument. It wasn't just that they made holes in this bone. Vulture bones are hollow by design, so someone actively thought, oh, I can make music come out of this. I can make different sounds if I change the way air flows through this hollow item. And some other important dates I'd like to talk about in regards to sound art. The first time that sound was kind of put in the gallery. It was talked about in the same terms as using sound as a paintbrush for artwork. was around 1982 when the Sound Art Foundation by William Hellerman was created. It was this organization in New York. And essentially the year after Hellerman created this event where traditionally visual artists came together and talked about how sound influences their art, how they interact with sound on a daily basis, say the sound of a paintbrush, and so on and so forth. Another important date, the Klankenbos, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was founded. The Klankenbos is essentially a museum dedicated to sound art. So I'll show a video in a second, but it's a forest where there are all these sound art installations. You can travel through use of a guide, or you can just kind of get lost there and follow all the eerie sounds coming from a tree or something. So I'll show you a video of this.
Tienduizend bezoekers vonden al hun weg naar dit bos, jong en oud, gezinnen met kinderen, scholen, groepen en verenigingen.
Klankbos ook veel meer is dan een collectie klankkunstwerken. Klankbos is een laboratorium waar we met artistieke tools experimenteren in een openbare omgeving in de ruimte die we allen delen.
So I'm going to stop it there so I can actually go back to this slide. There we go. Going back to my point about bone flutes kind of being the beginning of sound art, if you notice one of those, actually many of those installations, you can kind of classify them as just new musical instruments, new ways to interact with sound. When people started using the word sound art in its kind of beginning trends, it was used to describe more experimental musical compositions. So that there weren't a lot of visual components that were associated with it. But now the current trends, I'd say from the later 90s to now, many things that people associate with sound art tend to be new ways to interact and experience music and sound. And now, talking about the present, there are multiple sound art degree programs and organizations around the world. For example, in Zurich, there's the Institute of Computer Music and Sound Technology, and they're doing some great work. Actually, a lot of the things that you saw with Klankenbos and that you'll see during this presentation, they do very similar works. And there's also the Muda Museum in Zurich. It's a digital art museum, but they many times have sound artists come and demonstrate their projects. And there are new sound art programs in London and in Canada. So I'm going to explain the types of sound art there are. I'm sure that there are more types, but just in my experience, the three types that I come across the most fall into these three categories: generative, interactive, and experiential. So generative would mean any sound or music that is triggered, is conveyed through external sources. So the example that I give here is the Zadar C organ. It was created by an architect named Nikola Basic, and it's in Croatia. Essentially what this C organ is, it looks like a set of stairs, and it's right on the harbor of Zadar. And when wind and waves come into the aqueducts of these stairs, you hear music. And it's completely based off of the waxing and waning of waves and how those affect cylinders within the organ. So I'm going to show you a brief example of the C organ. I find a lot of these projects are better to show through video rather than solely describing. So I'll show you the video. So I've actually been here personally. I don't think any video really does it justice. I highly recommend going and visiting the C organ yourself. It's a lot louder for one, but also in terms of a visual aspect that I didn't think about through the creation of this new musical instrument or creation of sound art is when we went, it was much more crowded. And there were all these people in really weird positions, like all around the stairs. And they were kind of trying to listen and watch the waves at the same time, trying to guess what sound would come out of where and try to kind of guess this really, I guess, unguessable musical composition because, I mean, it's nature. Nature doesn't follow our rules at all. But I highly recommend it. There's also a light show that happens right next to the Zadar C organ that harnesses the power of the sun, and it's really fascinating. Zadar is beautiful, and this project actually was created for Zadar was this part, the harbor was destroyed during World War II, and so they created just this blank wall, but they wanted to do something a bit different with it. So they hired this architect who said, "Hey, I'm really interested in sound, and I've had this idea for a while to harness our beautiful waves and scenery." And what the video doesn't really show very well is how far you can see the waves out. When I went, the waves were very large, so things were kind of splashing over and hitting, and it was a very chaotic sort of piece. So the other, one of the other types of sound art would be interactive. So I actually have an interactive sound component for us to try later on after I'm done with the presentation. But interactive would, there are a lot of crossovers between all of these types. So interactive would be kind of like generative in that sound and music is being created through external factors, but that external factor is usually humans. That's where I would like to make the distinction. So I'm going to show you a piece that uses capacitive touch and proximity sensing. So capacitive touch is just something being touch sensitive. You touch on this and you hear a sound. So I'll show you an example. So essentially, this piece allows you to create your own music and create harmonies by performing. But right here in these cylinders are proximity sensors that sense how far you are from everything else in the room. And they emit frequencies based off of that. And the lines are, I believe that it's conductive tape. So it's tape that it kind of has metal fibers woven into it that you can interact with. And lastly, of the types of sound art, I would say experiential is probably one of the most controversial of types of sound art because there's not a lot of visual components to it. Many times with experiential sound art, it can mean everyone here in this room surrounded by different types of speakers and frequencies being emitted over time. There's actually a piece like that by John Luther Adams here. I won't show the video, but it's called Bales and Vespers. And I actually went to see this installation. You go inside of a church, and he made a piece that spans about, I think, 4 days. So I didn't stay in the room for 4 days. I stayed for maybe an hour or two to try and get what he was trying to convey here. But it's very controversial because it's like, so I'm just coming and listening to sounds. Another controversial piece of experiential sound art is from the composer and pianist John Cage. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he has this piece called 433. And essentially what he does is he has a piano here, and he sits on the bench, he opens the piano, he doesn't do anything for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And his thinking was kind of to play with the idea of perception. Oh, you guys came expecting me to play piano. You came expecting this concerto, and I'm just sitting here. So it's a very controversial topic in sound art that sometimes silence can be a part of sound art and how you use silence. But the probably the most impactful experiential piece of sound art that I've seen firsthand. There is a project called the Lunch Counter Sit-In, and it's at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. And essentially, you have to sit at this lunch counter, like this bench, and there is a reenactment. You put on headphones, and there's a reenactment of what protesters went through in the civil rights movement when they were being told to leave their seats, being kind of jerked out of their seats, and just kind of screamed very hateful things to them. And I may be a bit biased because that really made an impact on me. As living as an African American in the U.S., I've heard similar things shouted at myself. So these hateful remarks, I think it actually was very accurate to the experience. And just one more note before I show you the video. So they don't actually, the video doesn't actually put you into the experience. It just kind of shows what it looks like and interviews a few people. The music used in the video, I think, is a bit disconnected from what is actually happening beneath those headphones. It's very happy music, and as a composer, I was just like, why would you pick such happy music? And it's like, you'll see.
Outrage over the death of Emmett Till, which kickstarted the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott. Who could forget Rosa Parks? And over here, there's a simulation where you can have the chance to experience what it was like to be a protester at a lunch counter sit-in. I tried it out, and I have to say it was like being transported back in time, experiencing what it may have been like for some of those protesters. I want to explain what you hear. You hear threats, you feel kicking in the seat, you hear dishes being thrown, names being called. What's your reaction?
It was terrifying.
It's just hard to imagine that we could treat another individual that way.
I see you crying. It was very powerful. I think it was really well done, and you could really feel the very difficult things that people were willing to endure.
This was for about 1 minute and 36 seconds. Do you think you'd be able to do it for an entire day?
No, I don't think so.
And across the board, that was the reaction to this this sound project. I mean, you kind of had a line of people, the people who didn't actually really know what it was. That there's a line of really happy people, like ready, like, oh, what are we in line for? And then there's the other line right next to it that are like crying and consoling each other. So it's a very, very powerful way to use sound to convey emotion, to convey a historical fact, the way that people have been treated. So now we're going to get into how I got started in sound art in general. So that's a little me. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I was really inspired by the guys at MIT. So a lot of the robotics engineering things. So I asked my mom to involve me in a lot of clubs that did robotics and stuff. And even looking back on this picture in particular, I realized that most of the projects I was really interested in had to do with sound. So this particular robot, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there's a sensor at the top of it that it senses a few different things, but it senses vibration and sound. So whenever it would hear a sound, it would stop or it would move directions. So if you can imagine a bunch of 5 to 6 year olds chasing around this robot and just clapping at it and annoying the teacher and like trying to put it to the test, I guess. That I think that's where things kind of got started for me. Through this same program, they exposed me to things like sonar, and we got to talk about submarines, and it was just so fascinating that people could, well, not people, but animals and devices could see just using sound. I don't know, I just think that's super fascinating. And at the same time as doing kind of this robotics clubs and stuff like that, I was working as an artist. I was a child actor, and I sang, and I was in a lot of productions, and I didn't quite have an appreciation for it at the time. I was like, no, I'm just gonna make sound robots, and I don't know. I guess that's what I'm doing now. So moving on. From Boston, my mother and I, we moved from Boston to Knoxville, Tennessee. And there I got a lot of exposure to some great music, so some jazz, some country, some blues, gospel, and I kind of dived head first into it. And I was really amazed by how people communicated through music. So like what we were talking about before, like how you can hear a sad piece and know instantly, oh, it's sad. Well, like I should feel bad. Or sometimes through the aid of things like shows or moments in TV, you can also associate sounds with sad things. But I started self-teaching myself saxophone, and I mentioned that there to go back to the point about bone flutes, and that when I started teaching myself saxophone, I was doing it in all the wrong ways. First of all, I didn't use a lot of YouTube to figure out proper technique. What I was most curious about is how just pressing one button on the saxophone while you're kind of expelling air, you could change to a different note. Well, like you can change all of these different things about sound through just these very simple fingerings, like closing one hole and opening another. So I then went to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville for music, and I learned a lot of just great things there. I was in the jazz program there, and something that is really cool about jazz, if we don't have many jazz fans in the area, is this. I think UT gave me a good sample of what it's like to communicate with other musicians. Well, like in jazz, when you're in, especially when you're a part of a small group, you use a lot of musical cues to figure out how to get to the next point in music, how to get to the solo, or what is this person doing in their improvised solo. And it's all this just amazing collaborative effort to make something that feels, to make something that grooves. Just the way that musicians communicate, I think is absolutely amazing. But that's kind of where my starry eyes kind of end for the School of Music and Jazz, only in that right next to the School of Music was the School of Art. And so I'd kind of been indoctrinated into the jazz program here, and I was just feeling really great about how musicians communicate with each other. And this idea hit me of like, well, all art it's not the same, but we're all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to provoke emotion. We're trying to express our feelings through what we're creating and creatively. So it was really confusing to me that I don't even think this map does it justice. The School of Art and School of Music were about 2 steps from each other. But like we would eat in the School of Art, and they would come and eat in the School of Music, and in both cafeterias. So people saw each other on a daily basis. That they knew what projects each other were working on, but there was zero collaboration. That there was just absolutely nothing going on, and that just bogged my mind, especially for the jazz program. Because jazz is so fluid. It's about communication, but it's also about improvising and using different tools. So that kind of really lit a fire under me to want to try and figure out how art and sound and music could collaborate with each other. So through that motivation, I also I went to UT School of Music for performance, but I also was trying to get my foot in the door in terms of sound design and composition. And so in Knoxville, there weren't a lot of opportunities for young composers to get their start. There were a lot of organizations, established production companies, but they weren't offering internships. Even if you're familiar with HGTV, Food Network, stuff like that, their headquarters is in Knoxville. And so I kind of started to go outward and into the art building, and I made this YouTube channel called Concept Art Music. And essentially, it was a way for me to try and take prompts from artists. I would message an artist, say, hey, I would love to feature you on my page, and either you have a pre-existing piece of work, or if you feel like you can create a new piece of work, and let's work together so we can kind of create a sonic story to your art. So kind of incentivizing artists, because it's a different way for them to display their artwork. And for me, it was good practice for getting prompts in the future and taking, okay, this person wants this type of composition, and they're influenced by this. So I'll show you an example here. So this piece that I'm about to show, it's supposed to convey a bit of progression. So both the artist and myself wanted to make use of the progression in the picture. It starts off kind of in a very tranquil scene with a waterfall, and then it gradually goes into like lava boiling, a very kind of dark cavern. This is more than a few years ago. I was using MIDI instruments. I tried to get frogs croaking and things chirping in there. Very ominous. So I hope that portrayed that this idea of really trying to take what an artist was saying to heart and collaborating with them. And it was a bit difficult because usually for composers, they're working with people who use video, right? That they use animation, they use moving images, so you see a certain level of fluidity happening throughout the whole course of the production. So this was a really big test to take a static image and figure out, okay, this one was relatively easy because it had obvious progression to it, but causing musicians to think about static imagery, causing composers to think about static imagery was a big motivation for creating this series. And that artist was Jeff Brown. I believe he's still creating concept art. I can't remember the last project that he might have been on, but you can find him on Tumblr, you can find him on DeviantArt, all the different avenues for digital artists to show their work. So through the work with concept art music, I started becoming very curious about, okay, so I'm working with all these digital artists, but it's still stuff that's online. And it's still compositions in a very traditional format. So how can we kind of bring music and sound into the physical world? How can we put music into physical objects? So I started doing a lot of research on different ways. I started teaching myself how to program little things that, so for example, touch-sensitive projects that I had mentioned before. I started learning how to make any piece of metal or organic material into a conductive element so that when you touch it, you hear music, you hear sound. And I started really getting into that. So at an art networking event in Knoxville, I met a blacksmith named Preston Faribault. And I saw some of his work, and I was just really amazed, and I thought, okay, that's the guy. I want to experiment and try to put my music into his sculptures and stuff. Which his reply was, "You want to do what with my work?" And he was very skeptical at first, and so much so that he initially he gave me access to his studio, but only through his assistant, Daniel Scott. And I think essentially what he had told Daniel to begin with was, make sure he doesn't mess any of my stuff up, because I think he thought I was trying to just completely rip apart his sculptures and put something in there. And I'll give you an example of some of his work. So Preston actually, you may have seen some of his work if any of you are sports fans. He makes a lot of the trophies for Red Bull sporting events all around the world, right here. And he also makes things for businesses. I was mostly interested in his sculpture work like this, and how we could make music come out of this, or if it was even, it wasn't so much solely a means to put music into it, but is it worth it? Like, does it actually add any value to add a sonic element to things? And working with him really helped me kind of figure out my own personal feelings on that. So like I said, I was working with this assistant, and they gave me some of Preston's like older work that he was like, I might auction this off. But when I started really learning more about the programming and doing touch-sensitive work, he saw that, and he started coming over more. And he's like, I'll come for your next meeting, and stuff like that. And eventually he started sending me music that he was really inspired by, which was awesome, because I could start composing music that reflected what he liked. And we would put, I was programming microcomputers, and we would put them inside of his sculpture, and the way that you would interact with his sculptures brought out my music and sound. And so at the same time, he was sending me all this music, and he kept telling me every time, I should have included an email from him. Every time he would send me a link of music, he would I wish I could do this. I wish that I could play music. And so his assistant was like, well, I play guitar. Like, how about I teach you? He didn't really enjoy that. He felt that it was taking away from the work that he was doing on his anvil, which is what he would create a lot of his sculptures on. So it made me start thinking about sound, and like there's just this cacophony of sounds that come from his studio, because there are all these machines working, and his anvil's at the center of it. So I thought, well, how about we make your anvil into a musical instrument, and take your workflow. You don't have to do anything different. He tried very hard not to conform musically, but what we did was we turned his anvil into this vibration sensing instrument. I would design sounds and make music, and put it in his anvil. He would strike it, and we started coming up with something. And that was the founding of our performance art collective, called Workers Strike. And if you've seen the posters for the event, this probably looks familiar, which was great fun. We did a lot of workshops, presentations, and so on. I have a few videos of us. But so at the center of these performances, like I said, what was his anvil. I actually had pretty much something like this connecting to his anvil here. And what we would do is, initially he would start making abstract forms, and those abstract forms would turn into wind chimes. He would make a structure of wind chimes to be used through every performance after. And during the performances after the first one, he would create different sculptures that people would see. They would have a sonic kind of story attached to the sculpture work. And he would polish them up and then have them on display at his studio and for different events. And you can see in the background, that's Daniel Scott with his guitar. So he played guitar, and he also welded in the background. So Preston was mostly on the anvil, creating all of these pieces, and then he would pass them off to Daniel, weld them together into something, and then we would keep displaying work, and it would grow and grow and grow. So there's a close-up of the anvil here, where you can see the sensor. There are the wind chimes here, and you can see it was very rough, the wind chimes. But it was kind of the first piece that we did in our performances usually was to just kind of give people an idea of what we were about, what we were doing. If people wanted to come up and experiment with the wind chimes, then they could. And then here's an example of what a polished product or finished creation would look like. So I'll show you a few examples of our performances. So that's just one example. So what's happening in that video is that I would create musical phrases or words for Preston to use his own rhythm of triggering them, and then we would start looping them. And we would deduct or add different musical phrases into his anvil and manipulate them and create, and by the end we have this full kind of composition that's on kind of a loop. So let's see. We also gave demonstrations, so I'll show you a quick video of chop. Okay, and it was very interesting with this format because when we gave demonstrations, we tried all kinds of different vocal phrases and stuff, and we had one instance where we tried to put Trump's phrases into because this was during the election, and we had to stop doing that because people got a bit too violent with the anvil. Like they would hear Trump's voice and just start smacking and like almost like damage the sensors and stuff. It was intense. And let's see. So this is a recent project that I'm currently partaking in, or that I've created. It is called Soundbite. It's essentially a tasting spoon that uses bone conduction technology. The idea is, I have it right here. I would like to collaborate with chefs in the Swiss and French area, and you would have food on this tasting spoon. And when you put the tasting spoon in your mouth, you hear music. And that's done through bone conduction. Bone conduction essentially, we'll go back to that graph that we have there. We're here again. And so the way that bone conduction works is it completely bypasses the ear canal, and it completely bypasses the eardrum, and essentially it just focuses on the bones. So as long as there are bones vibrating in the organized fashion that has music, then it can stimulate the auditory nerve here and send a message to the brain, oh, you're hearing music. And you can actually try it out after I'm done talking. I have a few bags there for sanitation purposes. You can rip a bag off, put it on the spoon so we don't have germs. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for being such a great audience. If you have any questions, we can have them now. Oh. Well, if you have any questions you would like to direct to me personally, you can go to my website or marquis.b.mcgee@gmail.com. Thank you.
Of course, many of us have questions for you. I do want to explain part 2 of this event, which has to do with the podcast. So all of you probably know by now that Meet the Artist is accompanied every time by a podcast, and usually it's the artist and myself talking, like interview situation. But today we're going to explode the sort of format of the podcast, so we're going to discover something and create a podcast together as a group and take questions from the audience and have you ask the questions directly, and then we'll record all this, of course, and release it into the public, and that'll be our art project for the day, right? I mean, also. And we want to hear more about the spoons as well, because that we want to sort of test that out
Right.
somehow, right? So
Yes. And people can test this out. I also have, I'll set it up in a second. I have a version of the vibration sensing thing that I created for the anvil. So all you'll need to do is just strike around it, and you should hear something out of it once I've put the audio cable in.
okay. So I'll ask you to maybe collect a question or two in your heads, write it down, whatever. We will take a short break, and I have to figure out when to do the spoon thing before after the podcast. We'll sort of a 5-10 minutes break, everybody, and then please come back and ask your questions. And yeah, thank you.